Somebody asked me recently if I ever get nervous when preaching. And thinking back early on to my days in seminary, I definitely did. Because we had to do about 30 practice homilies before we ever did a real one. And a lot of times we had to do it with in front of our peers. I remember the first time we gathered together with my whole class, there was about 70 of us. And the priest that was in charge of leading the homiletics, the preaching, he asked for volunteers for anybody to give their homily. So we all had to prepare a homily for that day. And if you can imagine, nobody raised their hand. And he was my formation advisor, so he knew me really well. We would meet about once a month. So, of course, he called on me to volunteer. I was voluntold. I had to go and give my homily. So I went up there, and that was the first time I was nervous. I definitely was. I mean, it went well, but I'm glad there was a podium in front of me because it's the first time I ever experienced my knees shaking. Because when you do it in front of your peers, it's just a whole another thing. And kind of fast forward to today, I normally don't get too nervous when it comes to preaching. But I am a little nervous about a homily I'm going to have to give moving forward. Because next Saturday, I'm celebrating my sister's wedding. So I'm a little nervous about that homily. Because I know on the one hand, I'm going to embarrass her. Because one, I'm her brother, and that's what brothers do. And two, I know the family's expecting it anyway. So I know that's just going to be a part of it. Now, finding the delicate balance, that's going to be the trick, because obviously you don't want to do it too much, but you got to do a little bit. So we'll see how that one goes. I am a little nervous for that one. But the one thing I do know I'm going to preach on, certainly, is that of love. For those, it'd be pretty odd, really, if you went to a wedding and you didn't hear about love in any context, because that's really everything that's centered on that day. The marriage, the love between the two of them, all this is centered on love, the sacrament that they celebrate together. And for those that are married here, those that have been to a wedding, you hear those words all throughout that Mass. All throughout a wedding, you hear the word love. Go to the vows. For those that have exchanged those vows, how many years ago, as they say, I promise to love you and to honor you all the days of my life. I promise to love you. A love that is given freely, a love that is given fully, and a love that's given permanently. That love that invites those two spouses to lay down their life for the other person, so that it's no longer about them, the individual, but about the other person, and doing that together so that the two may become one. And then it's that same love that we hear focused on in our readings for this weekend. As we hear in our second reading from the first letter of St. John, we hear from the very beginning that love is of God. Love is of God. And if we're called to imitate that, which we are, we're called to love, firstly, God. And obviously that makes sense. We've heard that our whole life, to love God above everything else. That's the first commandment, right? Remember the 10 Commandments? We won't do a quiz on that. Normally we know the first one, though. My parents always reminded me of the fourth one. I knew the fourth one very well. But the first one, right? Love God. I am the Lord your God. You shall not have other gods besides me. Love God above all things. And of course, He made us. He brought us into existence. He deserves all of our love. We heard that all the way from the beginning of the Bible. But the novelty, the uniqueness of the New Testament in some sense is that Jesus encourages us, yes, definitely, love God above all things, but love one another as well. And for those that it might have been a little difficult to hear, because if you go back to those times, to love your family, okay, easy enough. Doesn't mean that we always love our family. I know we get into fights and stuff. I had to laugh during the 7:30 Mass because there was a nice couple in front. I said, we love our family, but sometimes we get into fights. I saw her smacking her husband. But, because we're not naive, we know that sometimes that's all part of it. But we do love our family when it comes down to it. Those that share the things that we do, that share the religion during that time, okay, easy enough. We can love our family, those that are Jewish as well. But Jesus takes it a step beyond. Because He says, love one another. And that includes your enemies. Those that by definition we hate. An enemy is somebody that we do not like, we hate. But Jesus encourages us to love those as well. Difficult. Those that are trying to kill you, those that are trying to take your land and possessions, Jesus calls us to love those as well. Now we don't have that as much during this time, but it's still present in our world. This is Jesus' command. In order to be truly children of God, we have to love one another, in particular those that maybe we'd rather not. Interestingly, that's how the second reading began, love one another, and this we hear at the end of the gospel as well. After Jesus recounts to His disciples the importance of keeping the commandments, laying down their lives for others, listening to the Master, following the Master, He commands them, tells them to love one another. I think the obvious question then is how? How do we love one another? And in particular, maybe those we'd rather not love. Those that make it sometimes hard to be loved. Now, certainly we look at Jesus and his life. He gives us plenty of answers, plenty of responses to that question. He is the example. He is the model. No doubt about it. We're called to do good to those that we love, those that we're called to be with. Yep, so do no harm to the person. That's a way of loving them. Praying for them. Yep, that's a way of loving them as well. Being kind to them. All those as well. But this morning, I'd just like to offer just 3 small examples of which to love one another. And things that maybe we do, but we might not think about, that is a way of loving one another. So just 3 small examples to take with us this morning. The first, focus on the person in front of you. I feel like it happens so often that in the midst of the busyness of life, all this stuff that's running through our minds, we could be talking to somebody, they're right in front of us, but we're not really focused. We're not really giving them our attention. I know I've definitely been guilty of this throughout my life. In the midst of the parish, a lot of stuff going on, a lot of stuff on my mind, and sometimes I don't always give that person the time of day that they deserve. Because as God's creature, they deserve that love. And in me giving them their time, all of us giving them our time, it's a way of loving them. Imagine if it was Jesus. Imagine if it was our Blessed Mother. Imagine if it was St. Francis of Assisi standing in front of us. I imagine and I hope that we would give them our full and undivided attention. But in a sense, everybody that we meet is Jesus. Go to Mother Teresa. She lived her life, she called it the gospel on 5 fingers. The gospel on 5 fingers. You did it for me. You did it for me. Going back to Matthew's gospel. When you do these things for the least of our brothers, we do it for him. And that's what Mother Teresa did. Everybody that she met, everybody that she cared for and ministered to, that was Jesus to her. We're called to do the same. Number 2, welcoming the other. Sometimes one of the hardest things when we find ourselves in an unfamiliar situation. This happened to me many times when I was abroad studying. You find yourself in a new place, maybe a new language, new culture, and this feeling of being alone, being on the outside, is a very hard one. But I can remember on numerous occasions that there were people that kind of picked up, okay, this person probably isn't from here. And they welcomed me. Maybe they knew a little bit of English, were able to communicate with me, to help me in whatever I might need. And though it might not seem like much, it can mean the world to a lot of people. And I think that's a challenge for us here as well in our own parish. This is something we can do as well. So this is the challenge. There's not going to be no test or anything. But during the sign of peace, if you're sitting by somebody you don't know, which might not happen because I know all of us were creatures of habit, we tend to sit in the same spots, myself included. I always sit in the same spot. I know how that is. I know who you are, though. I don't have to introduce myself. But to introduce yourself to the person you're sitting by, if it's somebody you don't know, to be welcoming. And that way it's showing our love for that person, that it's worth getting to know the name, getting to know that person. And then lastly, to smile. Simply to smile. Smiling can just be a very little thing. On the very least, it's just a nice gesture. It's a nice gesture, a way of being courteous, showing manners. But at most, it's a sign of deep love. Go back to Jesus. I don't think it ever says, I'm sure I'm going to get fact-checked on this, but I don't ever remember in the Gospel saying that Jesus smiled. But I got to imagine he did it all the time. I got to imagine he did it all the time. Those that he met, even those that were trying to kill him, I still imagine he smiled at them. And why? Because he loved them. Because he loved them. And in that love, he showed that through his smile. An easy thing to do, it really costs us nothing. But for those maybe in a relationship that maybe has been a little hindered, maybe a smile is enough to kind of break down that barrier, to approach that person, leading to an encounter, leading to a renewed relationship. So therefore, brothers and sisters, Jesus commands us today to love one another. He doesn't force us, because you can't force love, but he gives us the opportunity to do so in many ways. I just encourage you this day, just 3 little ways to focus on the person in front of you, to be welcoming to somebody you don't know, to smile towards that person. And in that, we are loving them. And we're fulfilling Jesus' command that he gives us this day to love one another, so that his joy may be in us and our joy may be complete.